as long as the peoples are armed against each other, there will be lying statesmen, just as there will be cannon and machine guns. One of the most notorious propaganda cues of World War I was the German corpse factory, the cadaver. On April 16, 1917, The Time reported that the Germans are distilling glycerin from the bodies of their dead, burning of bodies for fat, turned into lubricating oils, powder from bones. The story proved to be a popular one and was repeated for weeks afterward in the Times, London. On October 22, 1925, The Times belatedly blamed General Charteris for the story, which had proven to be the greatest propaganda falsehood of all time. Charteris, in a letter to The Times, November 4, 1925, denied any involvement with the story. Relying heavily on fake documents and doctored photographs, British agents deluged credulous American journalists with hot copy. The result was that American mobs began to attack elderly German shopkeepers, blaming them for the atrocities committed in Europe. In most instances, these shopkeepers were the most staid, as well as the most patriotic, residents of their areas. The principal vehicle used by Woodrow Wilson to justify his declaration of war against Germany was submarine warfare against American shipping. The keystone of this claim was the sinking of the Lusitania. In fact, the German government had published warnings to Americans in the New York press, advising them not to travel on the Lusitania, because it was known to be carrying munitions. George Sylvester Viereck showed this writer the actual clipping of this ad, which he had kept in his files. To this day, the United States government has refused to admit that the Lusitania was carrying arms, consigned to the British Army. In its issue of November, 1920, The Nation quoted D.F. Malone, collector for the Port of New York, as stating that the Lusitania carried 4,200 cases of Springfield rifle cartridges on its manifest, consigned to the British government. The Wilson administration had refused permission for Malone to publish this report. When Senator La Follette referred to it, they attempted to have him expelled from the Senate. Malone stated that he would testify in defense of La Follette, and the attempt was dropped. Later records revealed that there were 5,400 cases of ammunition on the Lusitania. The World War was satisfactorily concluded with some 50 million persons having been slaughtered, most of them prime representatives of the people of Shem. With this happy result, the Masonic Order of Canaanites decided to go for 100 million victims in their next outing. For this purpose, they assembled the most sinister members of the world's Masonic lodges at the Versailles Peace Conference. As Ezra Pound later pointed out over Radio Rome, the real crime is ending one war so as to make the next one inevitable. Woodrow Wilson became famous as the originator of the 14 Points and the League of Nations. In fact, he merely read from the script which had been prepared for him. The 14 Points and the other agenda of the Versailles Peace Conference had previously been drawn up at a secret meeting of the Grand Orient of France and the International Masonic Conference at their headquarters, Rue Cadet, Paris, on June 28–30, 1917. The Versailles Peace Conference actually consisted of a three-tier system, each distinct from the others. The first was the public conference, highly visible, attended by swarms of reporters from all over the world, and extensively reported. The second tier was the secret conferences of the Big Four, who met privately to compare notes and go over their instructions from their hidden masters. The third tier was the nightly Masonic conferences, known only to a chosen few, at which the actual decisions of all agenda at the conference were discussed and decided upon. The ministers of the victorious Allied powers were well treated for their cooperation. Woodrow Wilson himself returned to America with private gifts of $1 million in gold and precious gems to ensure his efforts on behalf of the League of Nations. When he realized that the Congress would never approve this dismantling of American sovereignty, he was haunted by the fear that he might have to return these bribes, and he suffered a nervous breakdown, from which he never recovered. Accompanying the Wilson delegation to Paris was an array of Wall Street bankers, among them Bernard Baruch, Thomas Lamont of the J.P. Morgan firm, and Paul Warburg, of Kuhn, Loeb Company. When they arrived in Paris, Paul Warburg was pleasantly surprised to find that his brother, Max Warburg, was the head of the general delegation. At Wilson's side was his longtime advisor, Colonel Edward M. House and House's son-in-law, Wall Street lawyer Gordon Auchincloss. Secretary of State Robert Lansing was accompanied by his two young nephews, John Foster and Allen Dulles. They were direct descendants of the Mallet-Prevost Swiss intelligence families, which had installed the Scottish Rite in the United States. A definitive work on John Foster Dulles, The Road to Power, by Ronald Brewison, published by Macmillan, fails to mention Freemasonry in the entire book. The Dulles brothers were later to play crucial roles in setting up the Hitler regime in Germany, preparing the way for World War II, and respectively as Secretary of State and founder of the CIA in the post-war period. Allen Dulles remained a director of the Schroeder Bank, which handled Hitler's personal funds. Dulles consigned many millions of dollars to the Schroeder as covert funds for the CIA. No accounting was ever made. Another disappointment for Woodrow Wilson at Paris was his resolve to achieve full-scale diplomatic recognition for the blood-soaked Bolshevik terrorists in Russia, a goal which was fervently shared by the Prime Minister of England, Lloyd George. They were dismayed to find that other European diplomats, fearing communist insurrection in their own countries, were adamant that no recognition be given to Soviet Russia. Bemoaning their defeat as a victory for bigotry and intolerance, Wilson and Lloyd George turned to other affairs on the agenda. Their program to make the next war inevitable was considerably eased by Bernard Baruch, who, as economic advisor to the peace conference, imposed the crushing reparations burden on Germany, impossible for them to pay, and forcing them to seek political relief. A ruinous inflation wiped out the middle class and set the stage for a revolutionary program. Whether it was to be communism or some other faction was not a primary concern for the conspirators. Whoever it might be, they would be in firm control. The way was now clear for the emergence of Adolf Hitler in Germany. His political party, the National Socialists, received the worldwide appellation of Nazi because it was the political party of the Ashkenazim, the German Jews. Ashkenazim means Germany in Hebrew. Documents exist with the signature of Adolf Hitler just above that of Max Warburg, who, with the Oppenheimers, was the principal backer of the Nazis. Hitler also had considerable occult support from the adepts of Astara, a society which practiced the principles of Tibetan magic, as adapted to Aryan racial theories. The cult centered around Astara, the Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring, to whom Oster month, or April, was dedicated. Hitler's birthday was April 20th, which may explain why he was chosen to head this movement. During the Nazi period, it was a day of great celebration throughout Germany. On April 20, 1935, Hitler was presented with 41 airplanes by the SA. With the following address: My Führer. The SA begged their leader, in celebration of his birthday, on the 20th of Easter month, the pagan Osterman dead, 1935, to accept their contribution to the rearmament of the German people, the SA Fighter Squadron. Tibetan magic claims to be untainted by its principal rival, Kabbalism. It also claims to be more powerful than any other known school of occultism, either Egyptian, Kabbalistic, or Hindu magic. Some of the Astara adepts close to Hitler became practiced in the highest principles of occult Lamaism. It was the overconfidence produced by the early successes of the regime, which had followed the advice of these adepts, the expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and the unexpectedly easy military successes in the first 2 years of World War II, which led them to their downfall. Whether Astara actually is superior to Kabbalism and its other rivals may never be known. But whatever magical support Hitler and his circle may have been able to call upon, they were no match for the international organization of the Masonic Order of Canaanites. Hitler's greatest flaw was his lack of experience on a larger stage. It is doubtful if in his entire life he ever heard of the Cannonites. Both Hitler and Mussolini, early in their regimes, were quick to outlaw the Masons, failing to realize that Freemasonry and the Illuminati have always been underground movements. They had been prescribed numerous times in numerous countries. These bans only gave greater encouragement to their furtive conspiracy. Neither Hitler nor Mussolini realized the awesome power of the determined men of Masonry, who exercised total control over the democratic powers. Another considerable influence in the early days of the National Socialists was the Ariosophists, the Aryan branch of the Theosophists. Based in Vienna, the Ariosophists exercised dramatic influence on Hitler's writings during his formative years. It is doubtful if he ever knew that Theosophy was merely an extension of Kabbalism, or that he was involved with those whom he considered his sworn enemies. Once World War II had been satisfactorily launched, it seemed that nothing could stop Hitler's triumphant progression across the battlefields of Europe. He failed to realize that Napoleon had also strode victoriously over those same fields, only to die miserably of arsenic poisoning on a remote island. No one in Germany could see that this was merely Act 1 of a carefully staged drama. Act 2 would open with the entry of the United States into the war, a possibility never envisioned by Hitler, and Act 3 would be Gotterdammerung, the melodramatic immolation of Germany and Brunhilde. Involving the United States in World War II was predicated on the successful operation of an end-run play, which Hitler never considered. He had no intention of provoking the United States, when the British intelligence director, Sir William Stevenson, repeatedly murdered young German sailors on the streets of New York. The German government ignored the incidents. Despite the expenditure of millions of dollars on frenetic war propaganda, the American people remained insensitive to the threat of Nazism. Charles Lindbergh, Jr. led a nationwide, America First, campaign which seemed certain to keep us out of the war. The answer to the Roosevelt-Churchill dilemma was Pearl Harbor, one of the most artfully planned slaughters of American soldiers, sailors, and Marines in our history. It seemed that everyone in a position of authority in London and Washington knew that the Japanese intended to attack Pearl Harbor, which was hardly surprising, because the Japanese secret codes had been broken months before. The nightmare of the plotters was that the Japanese commanders might inadvertently find that their codes had been broken and call off the attack on Pearl Harbor, since they would know that the defenders would be warned. The Washington conspirators, while breathlessly following the slow course of the Japanese fleet toward Pearl Harbor, avoided intimating to Kimmel and Short, the American commanders in Hawaii, that they were in any danger. Alerting them, of course, would warn the Japanese and cause them to turn back. The Japanese commanders later said that at the first sign of an alarm, they were prepared to turn back toward Tokyo without pressing their attack. A meeting of the conspirators at the White House on the evening of Pearl Harbor found them haggard with suspense. Only a few more hours, and they would know whether they had won, that is, whether the Japanese would attack and destroy the American fleet and installations at Pearl Harbor. Never has any group waited for bad news with such intensity. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who lived throughout his life on handouts from his mother, the opium money amassed by her father, Warren Delano, Bernard Baruch, who had imposed the reparations debt upon Germany, General George Marshall, whom Senator McCarthy was later to call a living lie. These were the men who had staked everything on this gamble to involve the United States in World War I. If it failed, they had no backup plan. Hitler refused to pose any threat to the United States. A book describing Stevenson's exploits in the United States, A Man Called Intrepid, on p. 329 provides irrefutable proof that the conspirators knew what was to happen. Roosevelt used his son, Colonel James Roosevelt, to convey his private communications to Stevenson to ensure secrecy. From information provided by James Roosevelt, Stevenson cabled Churchill in London, Japanese negotiations off. services expect action within 2 weeks. This message was delivered in London November 27, 10 days before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, a principal at the grim midnight meeting at the White House, later testified before Congress that he could not remember where he was at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, yet an item in the Washington Post showed that he had addressed a veterans organization a few hours before. He had then gone on to the White House. Marshall, a person of totally amorphous character, is presented to our youth as a great moral leader. In the campaign to get the United States into World War II, Roosevelt relied almost completely on the assistance of the British Secret Intelligence Service. Its Special Operations Executive had been founded July 1940 under the direction of C.1 Sir Stuart Menzies. Menzies was reputed to be the illegitimate son of King Edward VII. Educated at Eton, he had always moved in the highest circles of the British aristocracy. He was awarded that so in World War I. Lady Menzies of Menzies had been one of the founders of the British fascist movement in 1923, with some of the largest landowners in England, the Earl of Glasgow, 2,500 acres, Duke Abercorn, 2,000 acres, Marquis of Aylesbury, 40,000 acres, Earl of Cardigan, 10,000 acres. A later group, the Anglo-German Fellowship, had been financed by F.C. Tx, partner of the Schroeder Bank, and director of the Bank of England, which provided crucial financing for Hitler's regime. Also in the fellowship were the Duke of Wellington, Admiral Sir Barry Domville, and Lord Mount Temple, chairman of the Navy League. The cipher and signal branches of SO were set up in Marks and Spencer's headquarters building. Its chairman, Israel Seif, had been a founder of the Fabian political economic planning movement. With Menzies were the co-founders of SO, Hugh Dalton, brought up at Windsor Castle. His father had been tutor to George V. Sir Frank Nelson, later acting Director General of the United Nations, Sir Robin Brooke, later a Director of the Bank of England, Hugh Gaitskell, later Prime Minister, and Lord Christopher Mayhew. The SO operators took General William Donovan in hand to create their subsidiary organization, the American Office of Strategic Services. The British, who were past masters at every type of espionage and covert action, found willing, if inept, students in the millionaires' sons who volunteered for the OSS. President Lyndon Johnson later remarked about their successors in the CIA, "Do you realize that those boys are all the sons of millionaires whose fathers were terrified to have them enter into the family brokerage business?" Apparently a good time was had by all in London during World War II, such stalwarts as Paul Mellon, his brother-in-law David Bruce, Henry Morgan of the J.P. Morgan family, and many other fraternity brothers from Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. World War II did manage to meet its quota of 100 million victims, many of whom were entire families of the people of Shem, such as the victims of the fiery holocausts at Dresden and Cologne. Because they were the victors, no trials were ever held of the perpetrators of these atrocities. The Masonic Canaanites had succeeded in bringing off another great triumph, massive human sacrifices before the altar of Baal. One of the first tasks demanded of American army officers when they entered Germany was that they re-established the Masonic lodges, which had been closed by Hitler. In Italy, the victors quickly reopened the Grand Orient lodges throughout the country. They were heavily financed with covert funds from the OSS.